what is funny is very culturally based. So now you've got this great curriculum that I noticed. The curriculum that you created for the Second City is now a curriculum that's like yours that you're teaching elsewhere. So bringing it to Jordan, I'm thinking to myself, gosh, the things that are funny are so different. Talk a little bit about that. How does it work? Is the process about mining your own ideas, or are there things that are universally funny? I'd love to hear how you transferred everything to another country.
Those are great questions, and those are all questions I had too. So I went in September of 2019, but I only got notified I was going to be going in like the beginning of August. So I had 1 month to get ready. And so immediately, I mean, I'll admit, like many Americans, I am not super well versed on like all the governments of other countries, especially countries like in the Middle East. So I immediately got to work like trying to have context to understand like where their humor might be coming from. So like looked at their king, I looked at their system of government, I looked at their history of satire, which in Jordan,
history of satire, because I was afraid you freaked out when you were like, okay, no criticism, don't criticize the government. You'd be like, okay, there's like top satire themes. Like,
yeah, they
what
actually
time they? Yeah.
Yeah, they have a version, what would essentially be like the Jordanian Onion called Al Hudud, which is an Arabic satirical newspaper. And so that was started by a Jordanian, and it has like over 1 million readers a month. Like it's a very well-read publication. So I was able to get some of the English translations of that and read those, which gave me a sense of like some of the things that they were criticizing a lot. So that was really useful. And then when I got to Jordan, actually 2 students who wrote for Al Hudud were in the class, and they seemed like really flattered that I had read their paper and I knew about it. But I was like, you have a ton of readers. You actually have a huge readership. It's not just in Jordan, like they're widely read across the Middle East. I think they thought I was probably coming in a little bit more cold than I was. Like I'm a prepper as a teacher. I would never show up in another country and be like, hey, what's up? Tell me about yourselves. Although we did do part of that, but I try to have like some foundational information as well. So they had that. They have like a strong history of like using puppets and caricatures. So we talked a lot about that. I started with cartoons because I was like, cartoons are used, obviously in France and the Middle East, like across the world. They seem to be something that a lot of us have in common when it comes to criticizing and satire. So we started looking at cartoons. And then we looked at segments from late night shows that they might be able to adapt. So we started with form, and then we moved on to like a huge thing for me was I didn't want to be like a white person showing up there and like trying to dictate to them what's funny or good. I feel like that's not cool. That's not what I was there for. So we talked a lot about what they think comedy in Jordan has been like and what they want it to be in its next iteration. And then based off that, we made a rubric, and then we would run jokes and segments kind of by that and be like, is it fresh? Like, does it have a surprising take? If not, then we would be like, that feels a little aggressive. Let's not do that.
See, that's great. That's what I wondered. And when you look at how you approach things interculturally, that is a lot of what it's about. So you brought the process, but of course, what's going to be funny, there's no way you could come in and be like, oh, this is funny, this isn't, because, well, I think I'd mentioned I think it was Shankar Vedantam said, people think that things are funny when they resonate with their values.
Yeah.
And culture, one of the biggest manifestations of culture, there's 2. One is communication style, the other is values. So what you did is great. That communication style thing begs the question of delivery. Like, did you notice anything with how they communicate, the communication style that impacted delivery of funny?
Well, that's really interesting because the experience I ended up having was, I would say over 50% of people spoke at least some English, with most of them being like fairly fluent. But then there were definitely like 30 to 40% of the participants spoke very little English, or they could understand me a lot of the time, but they like didn't feel comfortable like voicing it back. So I had 2 translators, and I would hear Arabic in or English in my earpiece when they spoke Arabic, and they would hear Arabic when I spoke English. And so it's very interesting for like pure joke delivery because I'm on like a 2 or 3 second delay. So it was super clear to me when something was resonating with them because they would all laugh. And then I would hear the translation, and almost always I wouldn't laugh because I lacked the context, or it was like a pun in Arabic that did not translate. Like I remember one of the women, her name was Sajda. she made apparently a great joke, like punning off the idea of like a tattletale versus like someone in the army in regards to like a teacher strike that was going on. And to me, I was like, that's not a joke. I don't get it. And they were like, no, it's like an amazing pun. The translators were laughing. Everyone was like, it's a perfect joke. And I was like, all right, put it in the show. I don't need to get it. But that
Well,
experience, I think, was
sometimes, you know, sometimes there's words with language. So you can have two words that are almost identical, or that sound alike in another language, and there's just no way to translate that.
Yeah, and so, but the fact that like 16 people, 2 translators, and a tech person are all laughing hysterically, it's like, well, I don't need to know if that joke is good. It's obviously good. So it was
Did
interesting
that
for me.
make you blush at all? How did you feel when that would happen?
It's interesting because you almost feel dumb in that context. You're like, well, everyone here agrees that that was a very sophisticated joke, and I'm over here asking for it to be explained like numerous times. So I had to put that aside. And then when we started to do some sketches and stuff, eventually I stopped getting a translation. I just would watch them on stage and kind of watch the audience, and would like move them physically with like my hands for blocking. And it became for me less about what they were saying and more about if like the audience is laughing and I can see physically they're getting bigger, and then it ends on the biggest laugh. It's like, I don't really need to know what they were saying. I know the gist of the beats, but it's definitely functioning as a sketch should function. So let's do it.
So how would you handle feedback then? I know in some of the online courses, people write something, you give feedback, but again, because of the cultural and language differences, how did you manage that, or how did you manage giving feedback, and then how did you measure growth over the course of the class?
Yeah, I will say this. So we had 32 students and they were extraordinarily engaged. Like it was truly amazing. And so a lot of what I would do is like refer back to other people, or I would say, oh, that's a good idea for a punchline. Other people in the room, can we offer 2 or 3 other ones that are similar to that? So kind of asking other people to help me with the feedback, or I would point, it became clear a couple days in, like who was really gifted at topical joke writing. And so I would like ask them to weigh in. I had people write things down in Arabic and then like write that they should put tweaks on the end. So I didn't want to be the arbiter of like what's good. Like I didn't want to be making all these final choices. So a lot of it was, and I mean, that's the part of comedy that's like very democratic. Like if they said a joke or a thank you note and no one laughed, they don't need me to tell them that that didn't work. Like they know it in the moment. And so they know that they have to do a rewrite or that one is gone.
Yeah.
So we did a lot of like, they would read 10 jokes and they would only mark the ones that got a laugh and move on from there. So it actually, I had been concerned about that because again, I didn't want to be like creating taste or anything, but it ended up being like probably one of the easier elements of the whole process because people seem to intuitively understand if it didn't get a laugh, it didn't work, let's move on.
Oh, that's great. So then it was peer to peer. That is really cool because again, from the intercultural perspective, it's how do you immerse yourself in another culture and then adapt to really follow that lead in this case. What were you mentioned, which I love, that you really prepared a lot, but was there anything else that you were, I guess, afraid, for lack of a better word, before you went?
Yes, I was afraid of some gender stuff. I like didn't know how like if like we would have a lot of like men speaking for women or like maybe some women being afraid to speak up about things they wanted to say. And that turned out to not be an issue at all. Like it
What was
like
the balance of gender in the class?
fairly even, which also like we went with these 2 men, Moeen and Yazan, had come to Chicago, taken Second City classes, then gotten funding back in Jordan for us to come. So we were actually funded by the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, which is a German foundation devoted to like journalism and like cross-cultural understanding. They did a great job. And so they searched through the whole country for these 32 people, and they brought people in from like the border of Syria and like down in the southern part of Jordan, and they paid for them to stay in a hotel if they weren't local to Amman.
So these were hand selected. Do you have any idea what process they used? This is fascinating. So they went across the whole country and found, and I'm sorry, did you say where they got the funding from? Was it a foundation or personal?
Yep.
Or
It's the Konrad Adenauer Foundation. The previous year, Second City had gone with the support of the U.S. Embassy. And
okay.
then this year they applied to a foundation and got an even bigger grant. These 2 men are amazing. They're amazing at administration and comedy, a rare skill. And so they had gotten this money, and I think they got 100 applications for 32 spots. So there was real interest, and they selected them based off like some experience, but also like writing samples, what they thought they could bring to it. Like one woman teaches comedy in her town, that woman I mentioned before, Sajida. We had performers, actors. It truly was like, by the end, I produced two 30-minute late night shows, and my other teacher I was with, Jess Matolo, produced 32 7-minute stand-up sets. So like we got a lot done in 5 days. And like really, I don't want to sound like I was expecting low talent, but like I didn't know what to expect in terms of like the background of people who would show up. But everyone seemed to have like a really strong baseline in terms of comedy. They had watched a lot of comedy. They had strong opinions on comedy. So it was less like, you know, people who were like, great, what's a joke? And more people who were like, I've been listening to comedy my whole life. I have strong thoughts on jokes. What I need from you is a process to write my own. And that was like really exciting on day one when I realized that's what was going on.
Mm-hmm. And did you see any trends of topics? Were there any themes, I guess, in terms of what is funny?
Yes. So we kind of joke that like they have a very harsh sense of humor, kind of like their climate. And they said that to us. Like sometimes they would write jokes where I was like, that's a harsh one. We got to put that in between two silly jokes. Like we can't just have 32 jokes that are like really hardcore like that. There was a lot of joking, which I loved, about the way in which people from Jordan and the Middle East in general are perceived in the rest of the world. So this young woman told a joke I loved, where she was like, oh, I went to France and this guy was helping me with my luggage. And when he found out I was an Arab woman, he got real nervous. And I was like, be careful with my bags. All my bombs are in there. And I was like, that's such a good joke, because like it's on him and like his stereotypes and his misperceptions, but you're in charge of telling that story. And I just loved that. I loved that they were taking the stereotypes they knew people were levying against them and turning them on their heads. They made a lot of jokes about how the US is way more dangerous than Jordan, which is statistically very true. And so they would make jokes about how they weren't scared of like violence in Jordan unless they like accidentally got on a plane and went to Chicago. And then at the end, they'd be like, no offense, Kate. And I was like, you don't have to say no offense. I mean, your jokes are based in fact. But then there was a woman named Izzy who did like really strong material on violence against women in Jordan, which I appreciated. So they weren't afraid to broach difficult topics like stereotypes and like Western misconceptions and violence against women. And a lot of the men too had like very strong thoughts on government and family. And I was really impressed with like how willing they were to like look critically at their own society.
Was there anything that was taboo there that was surprising that might not be here?
So it wasn't surprising, but we were not able to speak about their king, which we had been told ahead of time and they were very clear about. And it wasn't done in any way where it was like censorship. They just were like, you know, this is something that's has a lot of value to us that we believe in, and we don't want to make jokes about it. I was like, great, thank you for that. Very clear. And then Islam, most of the students were Muslim, but we talked a lot about like who could make jokes about Islam, which I thought was an extremely interesting conversation. So the students who were Muslim like would make jokes about it internally, and some of those we ended up using. But they were kind of opposed to people who were not Islamic, like myself, who don't have like a ton of deep knowledge on it, like riffing on it. And I was like, you know what? That is a great boundary to have. So I was intrigued that they were willing to talk about their religion, but the boundary seemed to be more like it should be people who participate and have context as opposed to outsiders.
That feels like that would resonate in the US though as well.
Yeah.
I mean, there's certainly jokes that only a person who is of that religion or ethnicity or race should be telling.
Yeah, and like we had these talks on like day 2 of a 5-day program, and it was really fascinating to hear the translators kind of weigh in with me a little bit about like why certain things were maybe over the line or why I didn't get a joke and all the rest of them did. So I really appreciated the spirit of learning everyone engaged with, myself included, because I never felt like chastised by them if I proposed something and they were like, no, that's blasphemy. Or like if they proposed something to me and I was like, ugh, I don't love the punchline because that feels like you're targeting like women. So we had like a very healthy back and forth, and you know, tempers got heated sometimes. We had some arguments, but it never felt disrespectful. It just felt like, you know, 32 people and a teacher who truly cared about the content.
So that begs two questions. What was one argument that happened about? And then really the other is, what was done, if anything, in advance to be able to establish that depth of dialogue? You're coming in as someone they don't know. You've got the two gentlemen who'd been to Second City, but the fact is the especially with comedy, with cultural barrier, language barrier, and then something funny where you're trying to, like, go for the extreme sometimes. That just seems like huge room for things not to work. So what was an example of an argument? And then what do you think helped that process be so successful?
So an example of an argument, I do think part of this is fueled by the fact that it was day 5 and like we're all exhausted. And very often at night they were writing or they were filming stuff on the streets. I'm exhausted. My co-teacher's exhausted. Our translators are exhausted. And they also really cared. So on day 5, we're going to do a graduation show that night. Like the embassy is coming, the funders are coming. So there's a real sense of pressure. And I think we were all like, we had a bad dress rehearsal, which I told them was going to happen. But there was an argument after that about someone made a joke as an aside that another person in the class found disrespectful. They got into an argument about that. I tried to step in, but I couldn't get a clear translation of what the joke had actually been. Or I didn't understand what it was. So I tried to calm everyone down. We did, but then there was like more screaming over the microphones for a while and I couldn't even track like what was being said. So I kind of like dispersed the room. I was like, we have to take a break, let's all calm down. Let's go downstairs. Let's have water, coffee. Let's have some cigarettes. They took a lot of smoke breaks. And we did end up having, like, the woman came back and we did the show together. But it was very tense to be in charge of the energy of the room, not just in the moment, but going into the show, and to also not have a full picture of what was going on. Mm-hmm. So I'll share this. Like, I went upstairs to change clothes. I had like 10 minutes before I came back down. After 7 hours of teaching, I had 10 minutes to put on a dress, and then we're going to do a 4-hour show. And I like went up to my room and just like cried. And I was like, oh my God, are things going to fall apart now in the 11th hour? And when I came back downstairs, I was like a little emotional still, but someone had gone to get the person who had left and brought them back in. And we like all pulled it together. But I think emotions were just running super high because everyone had such high standards for what they wanted to do. And I think most performers go ahead. When you have a bad dress rehearsal, it's very off-putting.
Yeah. Well, I want to share something about the cultural influence on conflict resolution, but you said before we had a bad dress rehearsal, which was expected. What do you mean by that? Is that something that's typical in comedy? I mean, why did you say that was expected?
Because so it's the first time we'd assembled the whole show. And like I had told them, like, it's going to be rough. Like, we're learning. We're only on day 5. We've only spent at this point 25 hours together. So we went from 25 hours not knowing each other at all to writing whole shows and performing them. So like there's a lot going on. But the first time you assemble all the pieces, it's always much too long. The jokes don't work because you have to tweak them. And I knew that going in, that like we were going to have to make changes. And I had told them that, but I think still when they saw their show completely bomb, they were frightened. Like, oh my God, like, are we going to make fools of ourselves? And so that's when I really feel like I had to lead them more like emotionally and experience-wise. Like I had to get them to defer to my experience and be like, no, it will be fine. Here are the edits. Omar, here's your note. Like, give everyone very focused notes. But I completely understand why they got upset. Like, it's until you've been in that space where you're like, oh no, it might not work out. And then seeing it work out later, you just assume it won't work out. So I think that's where you're coming from.
Well, and I wonder too, I did some work with police departments, and we look at the influence of culture on conflict resolution. And some people resolve conflicts by very direct vocal words. Yeah. And I believe that that is more culturally typical, let's say in Jordan, but other people, and sometimes this might be not everyone, individuals are always individuals, but other people resolve conflict through relationships. So you want to make sure that people get along first, then you can focus on the words, whereas other people need to get the words out. And so if it was very direct sort of expression of anger, I could see where, like you said, when you went up afterwards, that if that's not your style of conflict resolution, if you want to calm things down first and then we'll talk about it, if that's your style, but then another style is, no, we're going to talk about it and then pick up the pieces and we'll be fine. those are very different. You put those together and clearly you're going to have different emotions. So I can see where that would be.
Yeah. And I also like I had at that point picked up that they were super direct, and I actually I'm also very direct, but that even went beyond my directness, and it felt like it was getting so heated that we had to diffuse it in the moment. So I mean that was a huge teaching moment for me too, and just when I left that night, we then went out afterwards, so it ended up being like a 20-hour day, all said.
And you said the show was fabulous, though, that the show that they tweaked what they did in dress rehearsal, and the show was a real success.
The show was a real success. It went 4 hours just because we also did all the stand-up bits and stuff. So, and also it was all performed in Arabic, and at that point our translators had left. So my co-teacher and I are watching the shows, literally not knowing what's going on. There were songs, there was a puppet, like it was very multimedia, and I loved it. And then after the shows, we did a graduation ceremony for an hour. So it just was like you start the day teaching, then you're producing, then you're directing, then you're producing again, then you're watching a 4-hour show, then you're graduating everyone. It's kind of emotional. Like I really feel like I lived like 40 lives in that one day.
So you're going back, or are you looking at maybe doing other countries now?
I would love, so I went with Second City, so I would love to go back, but it depends on what their needs are. So because I'm a writer and like more of a director producer, they might need a performance person to come next to help them with that. So they went out and they created a club called Amman Comedy Club now that's doing performances. Last week they sold out a 300-seat theater for a stand-up show. They piloted a late night show, and they're working on that still, and I'm still in touch with them on that. So they're like really working to create like a culture of comedy in Jordan. So I would love to go back, and I'm still in touch with everyone, and obviously Second City's working on it. But again, it depends. They might want like a pure director or a pure performer to go back next time. So I was the second year. The first year they sent sketch and improv people. This year stand up and satire people, and maybe next year they'll send sketch director people. But I would love to go back, and I'm looking to go to other places like Canada and Australia and the UK. And I would love to go to France because they have a history of like written satire and illustrations and cartoons. So I definitely kind of woke up. I used to teach English in Indonesia abroad. And so like I had this experience working internationally, and I hadn't done it for over a decade. And this like really brought back like how much I love it, how challenging it is, but also I love it.
And was there anything that you learned there, let's say something that was more common there that will now influence it that you'll bring back to your teaching, or even the comedy, the Satire and Humor Festival here?
Yes. So I had read this book that I highly recommend called The Art of Gathering by Priya Parker. And she is works for the UN as like a conflict resolution manager. She handles a lot of meetings between like companies, like people who disagree. So she talks a lot about like the intention of a gathering, and how like if you as a host don't create strong rules, you're basically allowing like the worst guest or worst attendee to set the rules, because they'll talk or they'll manage other people. So this kind of impressed upon me. Like I had read that book, and I had a very strong hand in these classes. Like if someone was talking, even though they were adults, I would go over and interrupt them. I like really created this culture of like, I'm here as the expert. You are all my writers together. Like my goal is to get you enough skills so that when I leave, you can do your own thing without me. And every minute you talk, you take away from our time. So I think in the past I was more of like a, oh my God, like we're all equals kind of teacher. But there I was like, I feel like I really have to assert status so we can get everything done so that they can go on and do all this amazing stuff they're doing now. So I think I would take a firmer hand now in the festival, and like in some of my in-person teaching, I've already noticed I've gotten like a little bit more, not like harsh, but just like I don't tolerate side conversations anymore. I'm not trying to be everyone's friends. I'm there to help people gain like skills in a process so that they can create their best version of their own work. And so now I kind of feel like if I don't set these ground rules in the beginning, I'm doing everyone a disservice.
That feels like an evolution of where we started this conversation, of this idea of this sort of inner thing saying, this is who I am and this is what I need to bring to the world. And it sounds like that actually, to me, sounds like a continuation of that when you look at how can I be the most effective and bring my best self to teaching. That's interesting. Does that feel that way to you? It's almost like it's like assuming your power almost to be more powerful, really.
Yes, I would definitely agree with that. And I'll say like I have been feeling like for the last like 5 or 6 years, I've been like gaining mastery in both satire as a format, comedy, and also teaching, although I started teaching when I was 20. So now I'm 15 years into teaching. But I feel like this was such a important experience for me because I was literally flown to another country as an expert. And I have to say, like, the people I worked with were so respectful of me as an expert, which is first off an unbelievable experience anyway, but also I feel like for like a woman, that isn't always the case. And so like I was like in this other culture and I was being given all this respect and like really listened to, like, and it just felt to me like I had stepped into this role of who I wanted to be. And I'm scared to fly, so it's 12 hours there and back. And so going over, I was very nervous, but coming back, I literally fell asleep on the plane, on the tarmac, and I woke up 2 hours in the air, which I've never done in my life because I'm so nervous during takeoff. And I was like, wow, I literally gave every bit of emotional and physical energy I had to this project. Like, I'm so proud because I know I couldn't have tried any harder, which I think is a feeling that's hard to get sometimes these days. Like, if you're not getting it physically, it's hard to feel like you used all of your intellect and knowledge to the point where you had nothing left to give.
That is fantastic. Are you kidding me? Who doesn't do something and then immediately pick the parts that they did wrong? What an amazing feeling to be like, nope, it wasn't there. I did it.
Well,
So,
I'm sure I did a bunch of stuff wrong, but just like the idea that like I couldn't have tried any harder with the tools I already have. Like, and if I go back, I'll have even more tools. But like for this point in time where I'm at, I gave everything I had to give.